The battlefield was chaos. Shouts, steel, the sound of flesh being cut. A Roman gladius sliced through bodies, blood spilled everywhere. They called it Roman glory. But for those in the middle of it, it was closer to hell than honor. And then, what? What happened to the men who didn't die quickly but survived with shattered bones, torn flesh, and broken spirits? Rome raised arches for its victorious generals. It gave offerings to its gods after every conquest. But the ordinary soldier, the one who returned alive yet disfigured, came back to a world that didn't want to see his scars. His body was marked, his mind disturbed, and his place in society uncertain. This is their story. The soldiers who survived the fight, but never truly came home. Roman warfare was brutal and face-to-face. There was no safe distance, no protective shield of technology. A short sword could end a life in seconds with sharp, practiced strikes. When it didn't kill, it left permanent scars. Spears and pila ripped through muscle and bone, often shattering limbs beyond repair. Heavy darts with twisted tips bent on impact, making them nearly impossible to pull out. These caused internal tears that festered quickly. Against enemies like the Celts or Germanic tribes, wounds were often worse. Their weapons were less refined, but far more devastating. Axes could sever entire arms. Maces smashed skulls. Long swords left ragged, gaping wounds. Roman medical writers such as Aulus Cornelius Celsus and de Medicina describe injuries that sound almost unbearable. Shattered jaws, teeth ripped out, faces destroyed, intestines hanging from the body. Many men survived the clash of steel, only to die slowly in the days after. Infection, fever, and rotting flesh claimed them. There was no concept of sterilization. Wounded men lay on filthy ground mixed with mud, excrement, and the blood of both men and animals. If fortune was with them, comrades dragged them away. If not, they lay there until the battle was over. And for those still alive, the agony was just beginning. Even when the body clung to life, the mind could give in. Another kind of war began silent, invisible. Some soldiers came back with no scars on their skin, but with torment inside. Today we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. Back then it had no name, no treatment, and certainly no sympathy. These men lived with nightmares, sleepless nights, uncontrollable rage, panic, and isolation. Some rejoined the army not out of loyalty, but because they had no other way to live. Others withdrew completely, disappearing into the shadows of society, some ending their lives by their own hand. Roman culture did not recognize this as the cost of war. To them, it was weakness. Strength meant silence. To suffer too openly was considered dishonorable. Tacitus, in his annals, speaks of veterans from the Germanic wars who refused to join public festivals, avoided other people, and shut themselves away. They carried a wound that wasn't visible, but was powerful enough to separate them from the living. Rome could shape armies. It could crush enemies. But it had no place for soldiers whose souls had been shattered. Pain without blood was invisible to the empire. And when the pain did bleed, when flesh split open and blood poured, out others stepped forward, men with steady hands and grim courage. They were the Medici, the army's doctors. These physicians were not trained to heal completely, but to patch men up just enough to keep them fighting. Every permanent camp had a valetudinarium, a military hospital. They were divided into sections: open wounds, fevers, infections, and recovery. The Medici followed the knowledge of writers like Celsus, Galen, and Dioscorides. They poured wine or vinegar into cuts to kill germs and used herbs such as mandrake or willow bark to dull the pain. But with a severe wound, the choices were grim: fire or the blade. Bleeding was stopped by pressing red-hot iron into the flesh. If infection spread, the only solution was to cut off the limb. The tools were simple: bronze saws, iron hooks, rough clamps. The anesthetic was wine, or with luck, a natural sedative. Reports describe screams echoing through the entire camp. Many men died during the procedure itself. But the Medici were both feared and respected. They were not gentle healers. They were battlefield surgeons deciding who could live, who had to lose a limb, and who would not see another day. And even when soldiers made it past the Medici, their struggle was far from over. Reaching safety was often worse than the treatment. If a battle happened far from a permanent camp, wounded men had to endure transport that would be considered cruel by today's standards. Cloaks tied to spears became stretchers. Wooden carts without suspension, pulled by oxen, bounced along rough Roman roads. Each jolt was torture. Rome's supply systems were efficient, but compassion was not their priority. The army moved as one, and the injured were dragged along if possible. Many died on the way, silently enduring the stones and bumps of Roman roads. Later, during the Empire, Rome standardized the valetudinaria in large camps. These hospitals had separate rooms, drainage systems for dirty water, wooden beds, and stores of tools made of copper or iron. But even in these centers, safety was an illusion. The Romans didn't understand bacteria. Infection was almost inevitable. Soldiers could escape the blade of the enemy, but not the invisible killers that entered through filthy bandages and reused instruments. Inside the valetudinarium, far from the clash of battle, another war began, a battle against time, rot, and the soldiers' own decaying flesh. The worst killer of all was gangrene. Without antibiotics or an understanding of germs, a simple puncture. Wound could turn black, spread through the limb, and release a foul smell before death came. Survivors described constant burning pain, fevers, shivering, and delirium. Doctors tried everything they knew. Compresses made with plants like elder, rue, or garlic. Remedies described by Dioscorides in his De Materia Medica. Sometimes they worked a little. More often, they delayed the end. Galen, one of Rome's greatest physicians, admitted that often the only choice was amputation. Yet without true hygiene, even that often led to blood poisoning. Death did not spare the decorated. Veterans with medals died the same way as recruits lying, feverish on wooden beds far from home, their bodies losing the final battle against infection. In the end, the fight against gangrene was one Rome could not win. It wasn't glorious. There were no cheers, no crowds, no honor. For the survivors, the end of the battle only marked the start of another fight. What would Rome do with the men who could no longer wield a sword? Rome promised its legionaries much, and for some, it delivered. Those who endured the full 20 or 25 years of service earned the missio honesta, an honorable release. It came with generous rewards, land to farm, a steady pension, and for non-Romans, the priceless gift of citizenship. Many of these veterans were settled in colonies, living out their days as farmers, merchants, or local officials. It was the empire's way of rewarding decades of loyalty and bloodshed, but most men never made it that far. The badly wounded were often discharged early under the title of missio causariae, medical release. It sounded honorable, but the reality was far harsher. Unlike the missio honesta, it carried no pension, no guaranteed land, no steady income. These men returned home disfigured, unable to work, and often dependent on family or sheer luck to survive. Rome, despite glorifying the image of the strong warrior, rarely offered real help to those who could no longer fight. Victory arches and monuments celebrated generals and legions, but never the broken men who paid the price for those victories. For every veteran honored with rewards, dozens more slipped into poverty and obscurity, crippled, stigmatized, and shunned by a society that praised strength but rejected disability. Not every wounded man was discarded right away. The Roman army was nothing if not practical. If a soldier's body was damaged but his mind still sharp, he could sometimes be reassigned. Men who could write became scribae, handling supply records, pay rosters, and daily reports. Others, scarred but experienced, became instructors, passing their knowledge to new recruits. Some were stationed in depots or watchtowers where duties were lighter. Under organized rulers like Trajan and Hadrian, this practice was fairly common. But in hard times, civil wars, financial collapse, or desperate campaigns, such opportunities vanished quickly. survival often depended on the attitude of a commander or the state of the empire. For some, these positions offered dignity and a chance to remain within the system that had shaped them. For others, there was nothing. And worse than being abandoned was being disgraced. The missio ignominiosa was the harshest dismissal of expulsion for cowardice, desertion, or dishonorable conduct. It was more than a discharge. It was a public humiliation. These men lost everything: pay, rights, even their place in history. In a society obsessed with honor, to be erased in this way was worse than poverty. It was a social death. Inscriptions from frontiers like Britannia reveal the names of such men, marked forever by shame, while other accounts show families who refused even to acknowledge them. Rome demanded courage, loyalty, and discipline. To fail in these was to be cast out not only from the army, but from Roman identity itself. For those discharged with wounds but not dishonor, the struggle to live went on. With no pensions and no land, many tried to support themselves however they could. Some opened taverns, workshops, or stalls in the markets. Others secured small civic jobs as guards, inspectors, or clerks. These roles were modest, but they offered survival. Others chose darker paths. Some became mercenaries, selling their skills to senators, governors, or merchants in need of protection. A few entered the gladiatorial schools where violence became entertainment. The arena promised money and fame, but also quick death. Figures like Spiculus, a famed gladiator of Nero's time, may have started as soldiers before stepping into the amphitheater. For many, fighting before the crowd was the only way to turn their pain into survival. Rome carved its warriors in marble, but also fed their broken bodies to the spectacle of the games. For those without land, without work, and without help, survival often meant misery. In great cities like Rome, Alexandria, and Carthage, one could find ex-soldiers living on the streets, amputees, scarred, empty-eyed, once proud legionaries of the most feared army in the world, now reduced to begging in temple shadows. Many weren't even recognized as veterans. They were invisible, forgotten by the state, and abandoned by the society they defended. Emperor Augustus tried to solve this problem with the aerarium militare, a military treasury funded by taxes, meant to provide pensions. For a time it worked. Under practical emperors like Vespasian, the fund was reinforced and payments flowed. But under rulers like Nero, the money was misused or ignored. And whenever the empire fell into crisis, the first to lose support were the men who could no longer fight. Many veterans died waiting for payments that never arrived. Others clung to small favors from commanders or governors. Most simply faded away, swallowed by the empire they had once bled for. Rome conquered 3 continents, toppled kings, built roads and monuments that still endure. But behind every stone stood the hidden cost: thousands of soldiers broken, cast aside once they were no longer useful. This story is not about emperors or glory. It's about the men who lost limbs, eyes, and brothers only to return to silence and neglect. Men who survived the battlefield, but not the abandonment that followed. Rome owed them a debt it never truly repaid, because surviving war in the Roman world was only the beginning of another fight against pain, poverty, and being forgotten. If this history speaks to you, subscribe to the channel so more voices from the past can be remembered. And tell us in the comments, did Rome owe its soldiers more than it gave? And as always, may Mars guide you in battle.